Hey, now I'm going to tell some fun and interesting and some very sad stories. These all come from Robert Crookston's family, which would be his siblings, George and Janet. Also from his mother, which would be the Youngs from his mother's line, and then also from Anne's line, which includes the Welches. So I am going to go ahead and do this. But first, when writing these books, I would read everything I could, and then I would take um, a story that I could put in them that is unique instead of writing their whole history. And I didn't want to write a lot of the same thing, all of them crossing the plains. So there's various stories. But this one's a very typical one. I want you to notice the date on this. Jim William Loosely from the Welch's family says, I was born in Clarkston, Utah, 1927. So I think this is a cold place. It's in the 20s. He says, we lived in an old home. My parents purchased it when they got married. It hadn't been used for a home for several years, but was used as a granary to store wheat. It needed some repairs before we could move in. I never remembered the house to be painted. It consisted of a kitchen with a small pantry. It had a coal cook stove, which was also used to heat the house. That's how they heated the house back then. There was no running water in the house, but there was a hydrant just off the back porch. We had no bathroom. We did have a path that led to a two-holer out back. There was a very small living room and one bedroom. The bedroom was a regular sized bed, a small baby's crib, and a cradle. There was no closet for clothes. You can see the home by present day standards was very small for a family of seven, yet they still had another child, and he says they had a loving family. So this is what you would call a three-room house. It is a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room. Before the 1900s and into early 1900s, when they first moved to Utah, they usually just had one house. So the Crooksons had one house. When their one son, George, died, they just had one big room, or big for back then. And then through the 1900s, they started going to two rooms. I remember one family that I read about, they had one room was the kitchen, the other room was kind of a multi-purpose room, the living room that became a bedroom at night. And they said the mother and father lived in or slept in the other room with and the other room was for the boys, and I believe it was their uncle. And that two house, had the stove and the kitchen, and it just worked they had to make it work for all of them. They did say that what they want, and that was early 1900s, they did say that they wanted to move into a bigger home because there's so many of them. And so this was their process. They got some property, they got a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and the father would dig and fill the wheelbarrow, and his wife would take it away because they wanted a basement, until he dug a basement large enough or a hole large enough for the basement to build the house on top of. Really more difficult times than now. But what's interesting on this is I keep coming across this thing, a two-holer outhouse, and I'm trying to understand what that meant. And I kept picturing, or is it so two people can use the outhouse at the same time, which just didn't sound right. This is what it was. So here's an outhouse. Here's an outhouse based on the lids on the toilet. Sorry, I imagine this is a little bit more newer than what they're talking about. But what a two-seater was is they had one large hole for the adults and a smaller hole for the children. As I've been reading, I came across one story where a young girl fell into that house, and that became very serious accident in that they don't have any lighting, and so it's dark down there. They can't use candles or any kind of matches or anything due to the fire hazard. And all they could do is just reach down and tell her, "Here's my hand, feel for it." And they barely could reach her hand outstretched, and they pulled her out. So it was a safety issue why you had two holers. Anyway, so here's what might a modern outhouse look like. So in doing these histories, I found out all kinds of interesting things. I mean, I found out that most of the kids like to go gather eggs with their grandmother because their grandmother would give them an egg, and then they could go to the general store and exchange an egg for candy, just various things like that. So here's another story that's a little bit interesting. Oh no, this is the same family, the same story. This is when he got married, which is a very interesting story because he tells about coming off his mission, and his friend was getting all the buddies together. He was going to line them up so they could, they could go out on these days if they come off their missions. And he has this dream of what his wife would look like. And so what he did is when his friend showed him all these pictures, he said, "I'm going to put this one with you and this one, this one." He saw, and he had a bunch of pictures of girls. And the one that he was putting with his friend, he says, "No, I need to date her because that's the one who was in my dream." He dates her, courts her, and they get married. And the interesting thing is in both their obituaries, they talked about how his dream is what brought them together. This is an interesting story. This is Ray Crookston, Margot Ray Crookston's wife, and he is from Robert Jr. Crookston. And Robert Jr. Crookston was his grandfather. Anyway, his wife writes an ad to the Maytag, or writes a paper that says this could be an ad for Maytag. And she put it, and this is exactly what it looked like. It says, "When our first baby was born during World War II, we used her grandmother's already 17-year-old Maytag to do the diapers. Now, 18 years later, Granny Crookston is still using her 35-year-old Maytag week in and week out for the family wash. So we decided to buy an automatic washer 3 years ago that has to work hour in and hour out for our Sizewell gang for 4 to 5 loads a day with 17 of us now. What did we buy? Why, a Maytag, of course." And so the Maytag liked it, ran her ad, and then this ad they says, now we ran an ad on the Crookston family in the fall. This is the Crookstons now have another child. They're 16 and they're still using their Maytag. They went on to have 17 children. She was a Mrs. Missouri as a mother, and there was a 9-page ad ran in, or not ad, 9-page article about her in the Ladies' Home Journal. She was the lead story, or the cover story. So interesting family. They're down in Provo, and that's Ray, and they're past, but Ray and many of their children are around. This is kind of interesting. This is peacocks. They came from the Youngs, so they were Robert's cousins, descendants, or his aunt, his mother's sister. And this is just interesting. He, the great grandson wrote this story about the Avenues, which is up behind the Capitol building. He says, "We enjoyed sleigh riding very much. In the winter, D Street and E Street were set aside as regular sleigh riding hills, and when there was a lot of snow, the hills were crowded with children and adults. We would start at 9th Avenue and go between 2nd and 3rd Avenue, and people living between 2nd and 3rd Avenue would haul all their stove ashes out to the middle of the street so we could stop. The hills were steep and would travel very fast. Streetcars and wagons were compelled to stop at these streets to check on sleigh riders before crossing. Because of the speeds that there were, accidents happened quite often, and sometimes broken limbs and even some deaths." And I thought, wow, what an interesting story of these kids all sleighing down and people just watching. And then it's so dangerous that somebody could have a death. Well, I'm going on, a few months later reading through, and one of the, I think it's one of the Holland's children, Carrie Holland's grandchildren, died from a sleigh ride on the Avenues. So the people they're talking about who died, they were cousins, but probably didn't know it. Just interesting. Here's an interesting story about well, let me just read it. Okay, I have 2 good friends that lived through the field from us, Clark and Joe Peterson. Their dad worked on a farm for Howard Furman, who owned a lot of land and cattle. So this is Nicholas Willis Welch telling this story. They also had a lot of turkeys that they would raise each spring and sell in the fall. One day, Howard and his men were trying to move the herd of turkeys from one field to another through an open gate. It's not easy to move turkeys because they won't go where you want them to. I asked Howard if he would like me to move the turkeys for him. They had been trying to get them in the other field for 2 hours without any success. He looked at me, a 12-year-old boy, and said, "If you can get them in the other field, I'll give you $5. I caught a big grasshopper and tied a string to his wings. Then I went over to where the turkeys were and tossed it to one of the big toms. He grabbed it. And as I led him along with the string, he flapped his wings, and the other turkeys came running to see what was going on. When we went in the other field, and all the other turkeys followed us on the run. Mr. Furman did give me the $5, but he was not too happy being made a fool of in front of his men." So that's kind of an interesting story. We had a lot of Crookstons that raised turkeys, particularly the ones down in Moroni. In fact, one of them was raising turkeys, and I think they had like 3,000 turkeys, and they got this wild idea of taking the turkeys to people's houses and put them in their gardens to eat all the bugs, and they made some money doing that way. I just can't imagine them herding the turkeys around. Okay, now what's interesting is Richard Marlowe Peacock writes, of all the different jobs, he says, he tells that he worked for a guy that gave him a job. In fact, he had 3 jobs working for this guy at the game, and he's a young boy, probably 12, 14 years old. At the ball games, I would sell cushions or scorecards before the game, and during the game, candy bars. At night, uptown before the show and during the mission, I would sell candy and chocolates at the Pantages and Wilkes theaters. For this, I was paid 10% on the dollar. All of these show houses had a small metal box on the back of every other seat that had 2 flat candy bars. The bars cost a nickel, and you would put a nickel in the slot at the top of the box and turn the knob, and it would pop up. Mr. Wolf and I filled all the candy boxes in about 6 theaters every Saturday, and it took us from 7 a.m. until noon. I made about $2.50 per Saturday on the job, and about $1.50 to $2 on the days I worked on the ballpark. On Sunday mornings, I would go onto the Salt Lake Tribune on Regent Street where the papers were printed and buy 50 papers. They cost 2.5 cents each, and I sold them for 5 cents. I'd make about $1.25 on Sunday. The things people did to make money. Here's another interesting one. So here you have this old theater, and this is Orville D. Lund, who's from the Welch family, says, "There were 2 movie houses in Brigham City, Liberty and on Forest Street, and Alberta on Main Street. When I was a very small child, the movies were silent, but later they had sound movies. The tickets were 10 cents a piece, and in the summertime, the Brigham City Health Department would give free show tickets for a cup full of dead flies. My father built me several fly traps. I would have a paper sack or 2 full of flies each week, and was able to get plenty of show tickets for all my friends and family members." I find this one interesting from Vernon Stokes, and he's talking about his Model T. "When I was about 17 years old, I bought a 1923 Ford Model T. The gas tank was right up in the center in front of the windshield. It was what they called the gravity feed gas line. It was used to feed gas down into the motor. In order to get it uphill, we used to put it in reverse and back it up the hill. If we wanted it up frontward, no gas would get into the carburetor." So I just figure that's interesting. You got as soon as it gets at an angle, all the gas flows to one side of the gas tank, and it doesn't go to the carburetor, so you had to back it up the hills. And in Utah, there's a lot of hills. He, I think, lived in the Brigham City area.